The courtroom echoed with his laughter, a cruel, jagged sound. "Look at her, Your Honor. She let herself go so completely, I had no choice but to look elsewhere." He thought he was publicly destroying his dependent wife. He had no idea she practically owned his entire future. The air inside room 402 of the Cook County Circuit Court was dry and suffocating, thick with the quiet tension that only a bitter divorce can manifest. The mahogany panels of the courtroom seemed to absorb the hostility radiating from the petitioner's table. Sitting tall, his posture practically vibrating with unearned arrogance, was Bradley Preston. At 34, Bradley was the picture of corporate ambition, a charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit tailored to an inch of its life, a vintage Rolex glinting on his wrist, and a jawline he frequently checked in the reflection of his smartphone screen. He was a mid-level financial analyst who spoke of himself as if he were a Wall Street titan, and today he was determined to shed the one thing he believed was anchoring his ascent to greatness, his wife. Across the aisle sat Clara. She wore a simple, unstructured navy blue dress. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. Over the past 4 years, a severe thyroid condition, coupled with the crushing stress of Bradley's emotional neglect, had caused Clara to gain 60 pounds. She was no longer the petite, fragile girl Bradley had proposed to in their early 20s. She had grown physically and mentally into a woman of substance, though Bradley could only see the former. Judge Harriet Winslow, a woman whose stern-lined face betrayed decades of listening to marital deceit, adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. "Mr. Preston, you are petitioning for an uneven distribution of the marital assets, claiming sole financial contribution and emotional distress. Your lawyer has the floor." Bradley's attorney, Thomas Langdon, stood. He was a slick, fast-talking litigator who mirrored his client's inflated ego. "Thank you, Your Honor. We are prepared to demonstrate that Mrs. Preston has been a severe financial and social liability to my client. Bradley is on the precipice of a massive career leap, and for the last 3 years he has been entirely unsupported by his spouse." Thomas turned to the witness stand where Bradley had just been sworn in. "Mr. Preston, could you describe for the court the deterioration of your marriage?" Bradley leaned into the microphone, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. "It's simple, really. I outgrew her. I work 60, sometimes 70 hours a week building a future. And Clara gave up." He gestured toward his wife with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Look at her. I couldn't bring her to corporate events anymore. In my industry, appearance is everything. How could I introduce her to potential clients or managing partners when she clearly has no self-respect? She spent her days in sweatpants, typing on her laptop at the kitchen island, doing absolutely nothing of value." A low murmur rippled through the small gallery. Judge Winslow frowned her gavel, resting loosely in her hand. "Mr. Preston, confine your testimony to the facts of the marriage, not personal insults." "That is a fact, Your Honor," Bradley insisted, leaning forward, eager to play the victim. "Her physical decline directly impacted my mental health. I was depressed coming home to a woman who had let herself go so completely. She refused to work a real job. She drained my resources. I had to look elsewhere for the emotional and physical support a successful man requires. That is why I am asking for 70% of the remaining liquid assets and the deed to the Gold Coast condominium. I earned it." She just sat on the couch. At the respondent's table, Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply picked up a matte black pen and wrote a single line on her yellow legal pad. Her attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, a silver-haired veteran of family law who possessed the lethal patience of a trapping spider, glanced at her note. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And your career, Mr. Preston." Thomas Langdon continued steering his client toward the grand finale. "Tell the court about your professional trajectory." Bradley's chest puffed out. "I am currently in the final contract stages for an executive director position at Valiant Ridge Partners." Even Judge Winslow's eyebrows rose slightly. Valiant Ridge Partners was an elite, notoriously secretive venture capital firm that had recently taken Chicago's tech and finance sectors by storm. They funded unicorns, decimated failing startups, and were known to pay their executives exorbitant multi-million-dollar base salaries. "It is my dream company," Bradley beamed, addressing the judge directly, as if pitching a stock. "I've had 5 rounds of interviews. The CEO is a private billionaire who operates through a holding company, but I've been assured by the senior partners that my profile has been personally approved by the top brass. I am securing my future, Your Honor. I cannot allow Clara to walk away with half of the foundation I've built just because she happened to be legally tethered to me while I achieved greatness." "Thank you, Mr. Preston," Thomas Langdon said, smoothly taking his seat. "No further questions." Bradley leaned back in the witness chair, exuding the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just delivered a flawless, victorious monologue. He looked at Clara, expecting to see tears, humiliation, or perhaps the pleading desperation he had so often tried to wring out of her at home. Instead, Clara met his gaze directly. Her eyes, a sharp and piercing hazel, were dead calm. "Mr. Penhaligon!" Judge Winslow called out, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Your cross-examination." Arthur Penhaligon stood slowly, buttoning his slightly rumpled tweed jacket. He picked up a thick manila folder from the table and walked toward the center of the courtroom. The air in room 402 was about to undergo a drastic change in pressure. "Mr. Preston," Arthur began, his voice, a soft, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate attention. "You paint quite the picture. A titan of industry weighed down by a lethargic spouse. You stated under oath that you were the sole financial provider for the household over the last 3 years. Is that correct?" "Absolutely," Bradley sneered. "My paycheck paid the mortgage. My paycheck bought the groceries." "I see." Arthur adjusted his reading glasses and opened the folder. "Let's talk about those paychecks. I have here your bank statements for the past 36 months. According to these records, your net income as a mid-level analyst was roughly $140,000 a year. A very respectable salary," Bradley defended, defensively sensing a slight. "Indeed. However, the mortgage on your Gold Coast condominium, the lease on your Porsche 911, your country club dues, and the, let's see here, $32,000 in jewelry purchased for a Ms. Jessica Trent over the last 14 months. These expenses vastly exceed $140,000. Arthur paused, letting the name of Bradley's mistress hang in the sterile courtroom air. Bradley's jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered. "I utilized credit. I am an investment professional. I know how to leverage debt." "You leveraged debt to the tune of $280,000, Mr. Preston," Arthur corrected, holding up a spreadsheet. "Yet miraculously, 6 months ago, This massive mountain of personal debt was entirely wiped out in a single wire transfer, a payment that originated from an offshore LLC. Did you execute that transfer? Mr. Preston. Bradley hesitated. He swallowed hard. I managed the household finances. The money came from a joint investment account that matured. Arthur looked over his glasses. A joint investment account. Are you absolutely certain? Remember, you are under oath. Objection. Your Honor. Thomas Langdon interjected, standing up. Counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled, Judge Winslow said sharply, leaning forward, her interest fully piqued. Answer the question, Mr. Preston. It was our money. Bradley snapped his polished facade, cracking slightly. It doesn't matter who clicked the button. It matters quite a bit, Arthur replied, his tone suddenly turning icy. Because my client Clara initiated that wire transfer from her personal independent business account to save you from defaulting and facing a corporate fraud investigation at your current firm. That's a lie, Bradley shouted, gripping the arms of the witness chair. She doesn't have a business account. She sat on the couch all day. She made pennies, selling knitting patterns or whatever nonsense she was doing on her laptop. Arthur turned to Clara. She gave him a microscopic nod. Let's move away from the past, Mr. Preston, since you are so focused on the future. Arthur pivoted smoothly, leaving the financial bomb ticking in the background. He walked back to his table and picked up a different, much heavier binder. You mentioned Valiant Ridge Partners. Bradley's posture immediately straightened. His safe space. Yes, my future employer. You testified that you have passed 5 rounds of interviews and are awaiting final contract approval from the CEO, who operates under a holding company. That is correct. CJ Holdings. Bradley stated proudly, wanting to show off his insider knowledge. They are revolutionizing venture capital in the Midwest. They only hire the absolute best. People who are driven, presentable, and aggressive. And you believe you fit that description. I know I do. The senior partners told me the CEO reviewed my portfolio personally. Fascinating, Arthur murmured, approaching the witness stand and handing Bradley a sealed document. I'd like to introduce Exhibit D into evidence, Your Honor. Copies have been provided to opposing counsel. Thomas Langdon scrambled through his papers, frantically searching for Exhibit D. When his eyes landed on the first page, the color drained from his face entirely. Your Honor, I object to this. This is completely irrelevant to the division of assets. On the contrary, Arthur fired back, his voice ringing with authority. Mr. Preston has demanded a disproportionate share of the assets based on his superior earning potential and his impending employment at Valiant Ridge. The ownership and structure of Valiant Ridge are highly relevant. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Penhaligon. Judge Winslow commanded, practically glaring at Thomas to sit down. Arthur turned back to Bradley, who was staring at the document in his hands with a look of profound confusion. Mr. Preston, can you read the title of that document? Bradley cleared his throat. It's the Articles of Incorporation for Valiant Ridge Partners. And who is listed as the primary shareholder and chief executive officer? It says CJ Holdings. Bradley scoffed, rolled at his eyes. I already told you that. This proves nothing. Turn to page 4, Mr. Preston, Arthur instructed gently, like a teacher guiding a particularly slow student toward a harsh truth. the corporate unmasking documents required by the state of Illinois. Read the name of the sole proprietor of CJ Holdings. The courtroom fell into a silence so absolute the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a sledgehammer. Bradley's eyes scanned down the page. He blinked. He blinked again. His breath hitched in his throat, and the arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face for the last hour melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His hands began to tremble so violently that the paper rattled in his grip. "Read the name, Mr. Preston." Arthur demanded, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with finality. Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically across the room until they locked onto Clara. Clara sat there wearing the same simple navy dress, her hand still folded in her lap. But now she wasn't just his overweight, discarded wife. The quiet woman he had verbally abused, cheated on, and humiliated was looking back at him with the cold, calculating gaze of a billionaire CEO evaluating a terrible investment. "It!" Bradley choked out his voice, cracking into a pathetic, breathless whisper. "It says, Clara Jenkins." The silence that blanketed room 402 was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the kind of profound quiet that follows a devastating explosion before the debris even begins to fall. Bradley Preston stared at the corporate unmasking document, the black ink spelling out his wife's maiden name, blurring before his eyes. Clara Jenkins. He whispered again, the syllables tasting like ash in his mouth. He blinked rapidly, his brain desperately trying to reboot to find a logical explanation that didn't involve his own catastrophic ruin. "There must be a mistake," Bradley stammered, his voice climbing an octave. He threw the document onto the wooden ledge of the witness stand as if it were coated in poison. "This is a clerical error. A forgery. Clara doesn't know the first thing about venture capital. She sits on the kitchen stool in yoga pants. She sells crochet patterns on the internet." Arthur Penhaligon, his silver hair catching the dull fluorescent light of the courtroom, did not so much as blink. He leaned casually against the respondent's table. "My client, Clara Jenkins Preston, holds a double master's degree in applied mathematics and behavioral economics from MIT, Mr. Preston. A fact you seemingly forgot or willfully ignored when you decided she was merely a fragile girl you outgrew. Thomas Langdon." Bradley's attorney was furiously flipping through the thick binder Arthur had provided. His face, previously flushed with the thrill of victory, was now the color of wet chalk. "Your Honor." Thomas managed to squeak out, his trademark slickness entirely evaporated. We were not informed of these assets during discovery." "You were informed of CJ Holdings," Arthur countered smoothly, his baritone voice filling the room. "It was listed right there in Exhibit B, page 112 of the initial asset disclosure. It was categorized under Wife's Independent Digital Enterprises. It is not our fault, Mr. Langdon, that you and your client failed to conduct basic due diligence because you arrogantly assumed my client's business was a worthless hobby." Judge Harriet Winslow peered over her glasses, her eyes darting between the squirming analyst on the stand and the serene woman sitting at the defense table. "Mr. Penhaligon, enlighten the court. How does a woman supposedly selling crafts online end up as the CEO of Valiant Ridge Partners?" "Gladly, Your Honor," Arthur said, turning to address the bench. 3 years ago, While Mr. Preston was working his 60-hour weeks at a mid-tier firm, Clara was developing a proprietary predictive algorithm for tech market fluctuations. She coded it entirely from her kitchen island. When she launched the software, it caught the attention of several angel investors. She formed CJ Holdings to license the algorithm, and within 18 months, the capital generated was enough to establish Valiant Ridge Partners. Arthur slowly paced toward the witness box, locking eyes with Bradley. The stress of launching a multi-million-dollar stealth firm while simultaneously managing the household and dealing with a severe newly diagnosed thyroid condition took a physical toll on Clara. But rather than support her, Mr. Preston mocked her weight gain. He berated her. He called her lazy. And as we have established, he spent their joint funds entertaining Miss Jessica Trent. Bradley gripped his own hair, panic radiating from his every pore. "Wait," he shouted, a desperate manic gleam appearing in his eyes. "Wait, even if this insane story is true, we are married. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. If she built Valiant Ridge during our marriage, I am entitled to half 50% of $1 billion holding company. I'll take it." A collective gasp echoed from the small gallery at the sheer audacity of the man. But Clara finally moved. She leaned over and whispered something into Arthur's ear. Arthur smiled a terrifying, predatory grin. "Your Honor, Mr. Preston raises an interesting point regarding marital assets," Arthur said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a single, neatly pressed sheet of paper with a blue notary stamp at the bottom. However, 2 years ago, Clara's hobby began generating a modest income. Mr. Preston, ever the financial visionary, grew paranoid that her small business would complicate his tax returns and potentially make him liable for her business debts. Arthur handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Winslow. "What is that?" Bradley demanded, his chest heaving under his Tom Ford suit. "That Mr. Preston is the post-nuptial quitclaim and liability waiver you demanded Clara sign," Arthur stated loudly, making sure every syllable echoed across the mahogany panels. "You explicitly drafted this document to insulate yourself. It states in plain English that you relinquish any and all future claims, equity, or interest in CJ Holdings and any affiliated digital enterprises in exchange for Clara assuming total financial liability for her own work. You signed away your right to Valiant Ridge so you wouldn't have to pay a few $100 in self-employment taxes." Thomas Langdon buried his face in his hands. He was watching his contingency fee, his reputation, and his client go up in flames. Bradley's jaw unhinged, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. No, I didn't know what it was. I was misled. She defrauded me. You drafted it, Mr. Preston. Judge Winslow interjected, her voice sharp as a razor. She held up the document. "It bears the letterhead of your own personal attorney at the time, a Mr. Gregory Hughes. You cannot claim fraud on a legally binding waiver you initiated to protect your own wallet. You outsmarted yourself." The courtroom was practically buzzing with kinetic energy. Bradley was hyperventilating his hands, gripping the wooden railing of the witness box so tightly his knuckles were stark white. His entire identity, the wealthy executive, the superior husband, the rising star, was being systematically dismantled. But the job— Bradley suddenly wheezed, his eyes darting frantically toward the defense table. "The executive director position. I passed 5 rounds. Gregory Hughes and Mitchell Dawson, the senior partners at Valiant. They loved me. They told me I was a shoo-in. Arthur Penhaligon didn't return to his table. He stood firmly in the center of the room, acting as the executioner. Yes, the interview process. Let's discuss that. Your Honor, I have transcripts and audio logs from Mr. Preston's final 2 interviews at Valiant Ridge Partners, which were legally recorded as part of the firm's standard hiring protocol. Objection. Thomas Langdon cried out, standing up on wobbly legs. Relevance. My client's job interviews are outside the scope of this divorce proceeding. They go directly to character and financial standing, Your Honor, Arthur shot back. Especially since Mr. Preston used this impending job to justify his demand for the Gold Coast condominium. I will allow it, Judge Winslow ruled, leaning back and folding her hands. Proceed, Mr. Penhaligon. This court is fascinated. During his interviews, Arthur began reading from a transcript. Mr. Preston was asked to provide examples of his financial forecasting. He presented a highly sophisticated predictive model to the partners, a model that secured his advancement to the final round. Arthur lowered the paper and stared a hole straight through Bradley. Tell the court, Mr. Preston, who built that model? Bradley was violently shaking his head. I tweaked it. It was mine. I presented it. You stole it. Arthur barked, his voice cracking like a whip. You copied an algorithm file from Clara's laptop while she was asleep. You didn't even understand the math behind it. You presented your wife's genius as your own to impress her own company. I am the man of the house, Bradley screamed, losing whatever shreds of sanity he had left. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger at Clara. Everything she did was because I provided a roof over her head. She owes me. I am the reason she had the time to do any of this. Clara slowly pushed her chair back. She stood up. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't look angry. She didn't look heartbroken. She looked completely, utterly indifferent, which to a narcissist like Bradley was the ultimate punishment. Your Honor. Clara spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, resonant, and commanded the room effortlessly. May I address the petitioner? Judge Winslow nodded slowly. You may, Mrs. Preston. It's Jenkins, Your Honor. I'll be reverting to my maiden name immediately, Clara corrected politely, before turning her gaze to the pathetic, sweating man in the witness box. Bradley, she said, her tone conversational, but laced with absolute zero coldness. For 3 years I sat at that kitchen island while my body fought a disease I couldn't control. I listened to you come home smelling of Jessica's cheap perfume. I listened to you mock my weight to your friends on the phone. I watched you drain our accounts to buy her tennis bracelets while I was silently building an empire. Bradley swallowed loudly, his eyes wide with terror. I bought your debt, Clara continued, taking a step closer to the aisle. When you were about to be indicted for margin fraud 6 months ago, I paid the $280,000. But I didn't do it out of love. I did it because I needed you clean and unencumbered for this divorce. Furthermore, my lawyers structured that payment as a lien against the Gold Coast condominium. Bradley gasped, clutching his chest. You took the condo. I own the condo, Bradley. I own the cars. I own the very algorithm you tried to pass off as your own. And as for your dream job at Valiant Ridge, Clara tilted her head, a cold, devastating smirk finally touching her lips. I personally reviewed your file last night. Your financial models are derivative, your interpersonal skills are offensive, and your tendency to steal intellectual property makes you a massive liability." Clara paused, letting the silence stretch until Bradley felt like he was suffocating. "Your application is formally rejected," Clara stated, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You are unemployed, you are deeply in debt, and you are currently homeless. You wanted to be free of my dead weight. Bradley, congratulations. You are completely untethered. Fly high." She turned away from him, her posture perfectly straight, and looked up at the bench. "We seek standard dissolution of marriage, Your Honor. Mr. Preston may keep his personal effects and his golf clubs. I want nothing else from him." Judge Winslow banged her gavel, the sharp crack snapping the tension in the room. Judgment ruled in favor of the respondent. The marital assets will be divided according to the lien and the post-nuptial agreement. Mr. Preston, you are ordered to vacate the Gold Coast property by 5 p.m. today. Court is adjourned. Bradley collapsed back into the witness chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of disbelief. He watched through blurred, tear-filled eyes as Arthur Penhaligon packed his briefcase. He watched his own lawyer, Thomas Langdon, furiously shove papers into a satchel and storm out of the courtroom without saying a single word to him. But mostly he watched Clara. She walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, her head held high, the heavy oak doors swinging open for her. She stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway of her future, leaving the man who had fat-shamed and discarded her sitting alone in the ruins of his own making, utterly broken and possessing absolutely nothing. What a spectacular downfall. Bradley thought he was discarding a broken woman, only to realize he had been married to a stealth billionaire who meticulously planned his ultimate karma. Clara's brilliant revenge proves that you should never underestimate quiet strength or ignore what your spouse is doing on their laptop. If you loved this story of absolute justice and corporate revenge, smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves a satisfying plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic real-life revenge stories. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were Clara?